Welcome to the Visualization in D3 lecture, part of the Principles of Data Visualization lecture series. We'll begin our conversation today with what is D3. I've heard of D3, it sounds cool, it's interesting, but what is this thing? So D3 stands for Data-Driven Documents, and it's a technology, it's a development class developed by Mike Bostock and Jeff Heer, basically to enable a little bit better grade of data visualization from a web standpoint. What D3 is a class library of dynamic visualization instructions. Basically, they're all the instructions on how to draw shapes, if you will. Now, it's a little bit interesting that D3 also has to work with SVG, and my previous statement may have been slightly confusing in that you're like, well, I thought we learned this SVG, and SVG draws the shapes, and that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely true. But D3 adds to SVG, to the SVG library, with an additional set of instructions on data handling, different types of functions that can be requested from the D3 library. It helps with things like scaling. So that these types of instructions or adjustments that we might wish to do don't have to be programmed manually. So D3 leverages some of those existing web technologies that we've discussed, so HTML, JavaScript, and the SVG shape library. It's leveraging all of those and basically working with each of those technologies. And I'll also bring to your attention the New York Times Visualization Lab. So this is probably one of the best visualization groups in the world. Mike Bostock works there. After he finished his graduate work, he moved on to work at the New York Times, and they work on all different types of visualization projects, and often those are built in D3. So let's dive into D3. We mentioned that D3 stands for Data-Driven Documents. And simply what that means is the creation of web pages or the display of web pages driven by data sets. So what I've described for you here is we have a data set over on the left, sort of a typical comma-separated value file. Often we look at a file like this in Excel, just a basic data file, sort of a flat file. Imagine taking that file and driving that into HTML pages, and what you see in the web page is based on whatever data was in the CSV file. So, and then imagine we could change to a similar file, similar data file, but had different values in it, push it back into the same set of web pages, and we'd see a different picture. So this is what we mean by data-driven documents, that the representation of that HTML document online, or that page online, what you see is based on the data. The data is driving what we see. So D3 is a process of binding data to graphical SVG elements or shapes. So if you recall, the SVG library is our shape library. And what D3 does is provide a set of instructions that allows us to pick up a data file and then draw the shapes that exist in the SVG library. So it helps us basically. Now, part of this whole structure here is understanding how data is represented by the DOM. So the DOM is the document object model that exists in browsers. You can think about it, as we've discussed briefly before. The DOM is like a internal table structure, very highly flexible internal table structure inside your browser. So what you're able to do, we're able to push data into the browser, and based on the instructions in our HTML code, a particular picture is drawn. So we have, for example, our CSV file, our JSON file. We update that in the browser DOM. So basically we take that data file, we push it into that internal table in the browser DOM. And then the DOM itself becomes like a little database inside the browser, where the DOM becomes the data driver for our documents. So the DOM, the document object model, it's a hierarchical structure created during page loading. So I mentioned it's like a little database. It's like a little hierarchical database created when we load a page. It provides access for the JavaScript API. So as we've discussed before, JavaScript is a technology, it's a library that's very good at taking responses from the users and displaying or reacting to those responses in a web page. And our DOM basically functions as a specification to use the data. So looking at the screen here in the center of our slide, you can see this is the DOM. We've loaded data into the DOM. So we took a data file, loaded it into the DOM, and what you see here is a whole bunch of objects. And what those objects stand for is all the data elements that we've loaded in from that particular file. And we've expanded one of those objects. You can see it there. Has a category, the sales amount, item description, item ID, the different menu item, that sort of thing. Now this could be anything. It could be any type of data elements that we've loaded in. In this case, it's a series of food items. Now the DOM, our document object model, is going to drive into our SVG objects. And so once we have our data in the DOM, so we've taken our data from a flat file like a CSV file, we loaded it into the DOM, and now we're going to use that data that's in the DOM in our little browser database, and we're going to push that data into our SVG graphical objects. So basically what this is called is binding our objects, the data, to the definition of the SVG object. So what we've described here on the left-hand side of the screen, that's our DOM that we were just talking about. It's in our browser. We've loaded data in, and we see a data element there, an object called gross sales, and it's a value. We have a number there. We can take that particular object and we bind that data element, in this case, to the rectangle. And we could do a number of different things with the gross sales, but the most likely, most common thing that we're going to do is we're going to make the width, some might call it length, of the rectangle the value of gross sales, because we're making a bar chart. So if you can imagine just taking that rectangle, maybe that rectangle, starts at no value, and then we insert our gross sales amount into the rectangle, and it expands from left to right the amount of gross sales to be a bar in a bar chart. And that's pretty much the way the DOM drives SVG objects. So we have our DOM. It's going to drive the representation of the graphical SVG objects. So here on the left, we have our little browser database called the DOM. It pushes values into our SVG shapes. through our code. So we engage the DOM, the objects with our code, and then it renders a rectangle object based on our definition. Now, where does D3 come in to this picture? How does that work, and what role is D3 playing? So the D3 library provides the DOM, our little browser database, instructions on how to bind the data. So in order to get from our DOM to our SVG object shapes, we need this D3 library basically to pick up data from the database and then tell the SVG shape what it's going to be. So data in the DOM is going to bind to SVG objects using the D3 instructions. Now, could we do it a different way? Sure. So we could go in and we could not use a D3 library, but we would have to draw or code all of the specifications for that SVG object. Instead, we can use the D3 library, and in the first frame there, defined as the head, you see we're engaging a script, and then we're going to have a source, and our source there, our http d3js.org, is our current D3 library. In that particular URL, that web address, is where the latest set of D3 instructions are. So we're gonna put that in our code. We're gonna go look at that library, and then when we look at that library, because we've done this engagement here, inside of that library, so if you're looking at the screen on the bottom left hand that's labeled D3 library instructions, this is inside of that library, and I've taken us to the exact place where you can see the D3 instructions that are specific to how to draw a rectangle. So I have rectangle circled there, R-A-C-T. Those set of instructions are then provided to our code over on the right-hand side that we wrote that says, I want to draw a rectangle. And you see that right there at the end of the arrow, it's R-E-C-T. Then creating paragraphs. So we're going to want to create paragraphs in our code. So different sections of our code to perform different functions. So we create a paragraph with the simple tag of P. We'll select and append a paragraph with P. So we see here in D3 scripting, if I want to select a particular paragraph. So I have a select statement there for D3, D3.select, and then I have that paragraph as P. I might want to change some paragraph text. So I have a statement, D3.select, the P.text, and then the paragraph text is written. So basically, the text that we put in quotes there, paragraph text written, is whatever we want it to be. We could also say, visualization students are awesome, and that would be what is written out to the right-hand side on the page there. Now, the last one there, append a new paragraph element in the body tag. So here we're just going to create another paragraph element. So this is another way we can use D3. So D3.select, we'll select the body, we'll append a paragraph. The style will have a color of red, and then the text, we've called that new paragraph element appended. Okay, enough with the paragraph stuff, but we can make this text whatever we want it to be. So a couple different D3 instruction sets there. The first one's to select a paragraph. The second one is to edit or change paragraph text. And then the third one there is to create a completely new paragraph or line of text. So these are just different instructions that we're using out of the D3 script library. Now, coming a little bit closer to what we want to do in data visualization class, we want to create shapes with D3. So that's our whole ball game here. So the first thing we may wish to do is to create a canvas. Okay, so if we look on the left-hand side there in the D3 script window, if we read down underneath the green code comments there, you'll see the first line in purple and black that says variable canvas. So we're defining a variable called canvas. Then we engage the D3 instructions, D3.select. So we're going to select the body code. We're going to append SVG instructions. Because basically, if you guys recall, SVG requires the definition of a canvas size. We have to have some little piece of canvas that we're going to draw on or paint on, whatever you want to call it. And then we have an attribute for that SVG canvas that's called width, which is, of course, from left to right, how large it is, and then height, from top to bottom, how tall it is. So we created us a canvas here that's 500 by 500 that we're going to draw some shapes on. Second thing we're going to do is draw some shapes on that canvas. So now the next little piece of code there, you can see in the comments, is to draw a circle. So you see VIR circle equals canvas append the circle. So we're going to put that circle on our canvas. Then we'll give it some attributes. So we give it a X value and a Y value on that canvas. So on X, we'll go over from left to right 50. On Y, we'll go down 120. And then we'll have a radius of 50. That'll tell us how big to make the circle. And then we have a fourth attribute there, and we say, and make it green, please. So fill my circle with green. And so now we have a green circle that we see over on the right-hand side there. Next little paragraph, we're going to draw a rectangle. Okay, so we see VAR rectangle equals appending to our canvas. So again, that's the same canvas, the 500 by 500 canvas that we started off with. We'll create an attribute. So our first attribute is the width. So we want the width of that line to be 100. And then the height. We want the height of that rectangle to be 60. And then our attribute, we're going to fill with red. So now we have basically our red rectangle there on the right-hand side. And some folks may be curious about the positioning or whatever. We didn't specify a particular position there, so it will just begin that rectangle at the 0, 0 position. Then drawing a line. So our last step here, we're going to draw a line. VAR line equals canvas append. So we're going to draw this line on our canvas. You see that we begin our line with an X1, Y1 coordinate. So we'll read over 20. So from left to right, we move over 20. And then we'll move down 50. So you can see we come down quite a bit from the top of the red rectangle. We come down 50. And then the second set of coordinates is going to be the far right-hand end point of that blue line. So on the X, it's over 300. And then on the Y, it's down 100. So that's given us a from point and a to point for the line. Then we're going to basically provide an attribute of what color line do we want. So we want blue. So we say stroke blue, and stroke is the particular instruction that says draw a line. And then we also give it an attribute of stroke width is 10. And so we've now drawn 4 different aspects. First, a canvas that we can draw on. The next one, we draw the green circle. Next one, we drew the red rectangle. And then the final one, we drew the blue line, fairly thick blue line. Okay, so we've just created some of our first shapes using D3. We also want to talk a little bit about binding with DOM objects. So as we've discussed before, the DOM is our little database. And what we're wanting to do is have data-driven documents. So what we're gonna try and do is bind data from our little database in our browser called the DOM. We're gonna have an array of objects that's in the DOM, and then we're gonna take that data and we're gonna bind that data to a set of shapes that'll be represented on the web page there. So if we look at our D3 script here, we're going to start with an array. And remember, an array is just some data values, sort of like a series of data in Excel. So our variable array equals the values of 10, 20, and 30. We're going to create a canvas. So just like we did before, we have to draw a canvas so that we can draw on it. Basically, the equivalent, the digital equivalent of getting out a piece of paper or a piece of canvas that we're going to draw on. So we're going to get out our canvas, D3 select the body. We're going to append an SVG canvas. The width is going to be 500 wide and the height 500 tall. Okay, now we're going to move on. We're going to create some circles. So the first one there, about halfway down the screen after the green comment section, is circle 01. So circle 01 equals the canvas append. So we're going to append this object to our canvas. The attribute, we're going to read over 100 on the x-axis, down 50 on the y-axis, and then draw a circle with a radius of 25. Then the next one, circle 01, canvas append, the circle, different position, CX 200, so we're going to read over 200, CY 50, so we'll come down the same 50 in a radius of 0.25. And then when we get to the bottom, we have our circles. We're going to, in our canvas, we're going to select all the circles, and then we're going to fill those circles with green, and then we're going to append a circle, a third circle that we didn't define above. So on the fly, we're going to create another circle. So we'll append circle at position 50 over on the X, 50 down on the Y, radius 25, and then attribute fill of blue. So we're going to make that circle blue. Okay. Over on the right-hand side, that's going to be the end result of this code. So we see our 2 green circles that we appended first. So first thing we did was we drew a canvas. And then we appended the first green circle. And then the second green circle. So we drew those 2. But we really just drew the circles. We didn't fill them with any color. It's only when we got to our statements down at the bottom that we said, okay, any circles that you've created so far, make them green. And so we filled them green. And then after that, we said, oh, I want to create a blue circle too. So we gave the coordinates attribute of filling it with blue. So the coordinates are also attributes. So every one of those is an attribute, the position, the radius, and then we filled it with blue, resulting in green and blue circles. Okay, so now let's go take a look at how we perform this instruction with a program. So we're going to do this with the screen capture so you guys can see the code working, and then we'll come back and pick up with some additional elements. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of our code using D3. So we'll drag a file over there, and let's walk through a couple of the things that we're working with. So the first one, we have our D3 library here that we've defined. So this is a class. It's going to use this URL. It's going to go out, and it's going to use that set of instructions in the D3 library we were talking about. Then we're going to come down here in the script, and we're going to create a data array. So here we have an array of 10, 20, and 30. From there, we're going to create a canvas. So as you guys recall, in order to draw shapes in SVG, we need a canvas, basically something to draw on. So we're going to use a D3 instruction. We're going to create a canvas that's 500 by 500. So then we're going to create a circle. So we define, hey, I want a circle. Here's the position I want it, over 100, down 50. I'm going to make this one a fairly small radius of 10. And then this one, second circle, I'm going to head over 200. I'm going to head down 50, and then I'm going to make it a larger circle of 25. Now, at this point in the code, we still won't be able to see them. Then we'll come in here and we'll select our circles, and we're going to fill them with green. So then we'll be able to see these two as green circles. And then the last thing we'll do is we will append a third circle, basically just add on a third circle. It'll be at 50-50, radius of 25, and we're going to make that circle blue. Okay? Let's bring our code into our browser, and we see it's created our shapes here. So here's our first circle. Here's our second circle. We turn them both green, and then we make our third circle by appending. Okay, now we want to move further into the heart of D3, sort of how does it work, where we have this data-driven documents approach. So now we're going to work on data deriving a visualization page. And I'm going to illustrate for you how the particular data values basically drive the shape of the visualization. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use a simple data array, and then we're going to push that data array into some shapes. And I think you'll be able to tell from pushing the different data into those shapes that the data is actually driving the visualization. So the first thing we need to look at is there's values in the array driving the size of the bars. Okay, so let's look on the left-hand side here. We have our D3 script. So this is our code. We'll look underneath the green comments, and then the first statement we have there is an array. So we create this array with 10, 20, and 30. We're going to create our canvas. So just like we've done before, we need an SVG canvas. So we're going to create a canvas, D3 select, the body, we'll append SVG, and then we'll create a canvas that's 500 by 500. Okay, then the next thing that we're going to do is basically define our bars, and then we're going to discuss how these different data values are going to drive the size of the bars and the location of the bars. Okay, so we move down to our next or our last statement. It says bar, so we're going to create bars. We're going to put them on our canvas. They're going to be of type rectangle. And then we're going to append rectangles. And then let's look at our first attribute here. So our attribute is the width. We're going to have a particular function. We're just going to call that function D. And then we're going to say return D multiplied by 10. Okay. So what that's going to do is in the first data element, which is 10, it's going to say 10 multiplied by 10 is 100. And so it's going to have a width of 100. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that first bar that's drawn, it's about 100 wide. Then the second data element is going to be 20. So this width attribute is going to create a second bar that is 20 times 10. So we're going to have one that's 200. And you can look over on the right and say, yep, it looks twice as long. And then the third, 30 times 10 is going to be 300. And we'll take a look at that. And yep, I see that as well. Okay, so that's our width. Then we move down to the next attribute of height. So with height, we're determining basically how thick these bars are. So the first one's 10. So we're going to do 10 times 2, so it's a 20. So that one's fairly narrow. Then we'll do 20 times 2. So now it's 40. So it gets thicker there. And then 30 times 2 is 60, and we can see the one on the bottom is the thickest. Then our attribute for y, basically we're going to multiply our I times 100, basically to give us a y value, basically a position on the y-axis. Where do we want each of these bars to be drawn on the y-axis? And so we're going to do 10, 20, and 30 through there. And then our last attribute we're going to fill as green. So what this is going to do, this code will basically draw these 3 green bars. And what I want to emphasize here is that the data value is driving the size and location of that bar. So when it's 10, we get a shorter, thinner bar that's all the way up at the top at, for example, position 10. Then the second bar, it's wider and thicker and is further down the screen. And then the third one is wider still, thicker still, and even further down the screen. So the data, whether it's 10, 20, or 30, the inherent value of it being 10, 20, or 30 is changing what we draw. The width, the height, as well as the location of these bars. And now we could also add one more aspect to this. So we could add a fourth value to the array, basically just adding a 40. So we had a 10, 20, 30, and a 40. And when we add that 40, notice that it adds a fourth bar. Basically, that fourth data value, we didn't add anything else other than just we added 40 to our array, and it drew a fourth bar that was, you know, a factor of 40 wide, a factor of 40 high, and a position of 40 down. And it's that data element itself that's driving, and that's what I want you to keep a close eye on. Okay, so now let's go out. We'll bring in some code. We'll let D3 provide the instructions, and we'll take a look at the visualization it's creating. Okay, so now let's take a look at creating some of our data-driven visualization using D3. So as we introduced before, we've got our D3 library going here. We're going to create our array with 10, 20, and 30. We're going to build our canvas for SVG, and then we're going to draw some bars. Now, each of those rectangles, we're going to engage the shape of RECT. We're going to go to the D3 library. The D3 library knows how to draw a rectangle. And then we're going to pull data from our array, and we're going to begin to insert it into these different factors of width, height, where it is in position on the screen, and then we're going to fill them all with green, basically make green bars. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring in that same code into the browser, and we'll see, here's our guy for 10. So notice that when we put 10 through our width and 10 through our height and 10 in our location, we only came down 10. So not very far, right? And it's not so wide and not so tall. But then when we get to 20, 20 is wider, taller, and further down. And the same thing with 30. So 30 is wider, taller, and further down. And what's going on here is these data elements, whatever is here, are driving the creation of these bars. So we use this simple notation definition. We just say we want some rectangles. We give it a formula of how we want those rectangles. And basically the formula is only handling the data. Basically, we want everything factored. And then the D3 instructions for rectangle take care of drawing the shape. They take care of everything else. So something we might do, just like we described before, we might add some values of 40. And why don't, for fun, we also add 50. We will save this guy, and let's we'll save this one as the 5 bar. So if we bring that over, notice we're looking at the 5 bar there, so everything's in good shape. Let's take another look at it. We've got the 5 bar, and now let's bring it in and see how it looks. So what we did when we added this 40 and 50, it ran it through our same functions here. It said make that a factor of 40 wide, 40 high, and 40 down on the Y, and same thing with the 50. 50 wide, 50 tall, and 50 down. And so that's what we mean by the data is driving the document. This is a data-driven document right here. Each of these data values drove the document that we created. Okay, so now that we have a feel for how data drives our document, the data is basically driving how that visualization occurs in our document, in our HTML document. We're going to move on to another concept called scales. Basically, how are different objects scaled in comparison to each other. And this is a very powerful aspect of D3 that makes it a very popular technology. Because we can change the size of our window, of our browser window, as well as change our devices, and the visualization will completely rescale itself to whatever size that is, and it does it very efficiently, and that's one of the strengths of D3. So we're going to talk about how that works. So as we've discussed before, our data drives the sizing of the bars. So what we see here with our D3 script on the left-hand side, we've defined an array. So we've got an array with values 10, 20, 50, and 70. We have some variables of width and height. We're going to create a particular canvas here. So we need to create that D3 canvas. And notice one adjustment that we've made here is that instead of hard coding our width and height for our canvas, we've put it in a variable above. So we've put the 500 width and 500 height up above, and then we've just referred to the width and height when we define our canvas. Then we're going to take a look at defining scaling for the data. So here we're going to create something called a width scale. So our width scale, what it's going to do is take these data values and their relationship or their ratio to each other. So 10 is half of 20, 10 is 1/5 of 50, etc. And it's going to apply scaling of our bars based on those particular data values and their relationships to each other. And here we're using linear scale. You can see that there. So the width scale equals D3 scale linear. Then we place in that particular function. And what that's going to do is it's going to draw these different bars with their particular width scale. Now we're also going to define a color scale. So we have our color scale here. It's also going to work linear, and it's going to work red to blue. So while on the right-hand side, you see there, we're rendering this in sort of a gold or a yellow. When we apply our color scale, it's going to change the color of our bars based on where the 10, 20, 50, and 70 come in the color scale. So it's going to give them some different colors. And then the last that we have there is we're going to draw our bars on the canvas, and basically with the values that we have in our array, we're going to draw a different width of bars. But in this case, we're creating a bar chart, and we want all our bars to be fairly uniform. So we're going to fix the height of our bars there at 50. And you can see that in the attribute statement, height, comma 50. Now here's where we're scaling both our width and color. So we have pretty much the same thing, but here we're scaling our color from red to blue. And that's pretty much the only thing that's different about our visualization here. So now let's go out and take a look at how we create a bar chart like this. So let's go ahead and take a look at our data-driven bar chart with scaling. So here we brought in our code. We've got our array 10, 20, 50, 70. We're creating our canvas. This time we're going to define the width and height above and just refer back to it. We have our width scale, so we're going to define our width of each bar based on whatever the data value is. For right now, we've commented out the color scale, so these are just going to come in as black bars, and then this helps us draw our bars. Basically, those bars, the object definition in D3 is a rectangle, so based on the data value is going to determine the width. Then we're going to basically pre-assign or hard code the height at 50 because we want all our bars to be the same height. So let's bring in this piece of code and let's take a look at what it does. Okay, so here we have 4 different data elements. So the 10 comes through. It's going to create a line that is on the width scale in proportion to the other data values. So it's applied this width scale, and then it's going to come through and it's going to draw our 4 different bars, all with the height of 50. And you can see these are all the same height, but their widths vary based on what the data element is. Okay, so now let's bring in color as well. So now in our code, this is the same code we've been using, but we've removed the comments for color scale. And what this color scale is going to do is, based on the values 10, 20, 50, and 70, it's going to place those values on a scale of orange to blue, basically a relative scale. Just like these would be fractional widths, these are going to be fractional colors on a spectrum from orange to blue. Okay, so same 4 bars, everything was drawn the same way, but the main difference here, as we said, we're going to be on a color scale from orange to blue. And we can kind of keep our eye on this and think about the scale. So if we're at 10, 10 from 0, that's going to be pretty orange. A 20 on that scale is going to move at least 10 toward the blue from orange. So that comes out to be sort of a tan color. Then if we're 50, that's a considerable distance away from orange. So you can see this one's turning purple. It's heading over toward the blue side of the scale. And then finally the 70 we see returns a blue bar. So this is scaled from orange to red based on the value that has been placed in the array. And basically the data is driving the definition of this document, both the width as well as the coloration scale. So we're going to talk a little bit more about D3 statements. So we've been using some of our D3 statements to create our canvas, to create some circles, create our bars. We've used D3 statements to adjust the width, the color, So now we're going to just take a look at statements themselves, just to give you guys a little bit fuller picture that, what we're doing with these D3 statements. We put a statement in the code, and it's sort of like a command to D3. Hey, we want you to do this. And so statements are a way to bring forward our requested values. And so let's take a look at the left-hand side here, some D3 script. So we might create a piece of code here. We have an array, which has a number of different data values in it. And then we have different statements that we could create in our code. What's the minimum value in the array? Of course, that would be 10. What's the maximum value? Of course, that would be 100. We might ask it, what's the extent of the array? Basically, show us the array. The mean, so we might ask it to go through and create an average from these data values. The median, the sum, so we could add them all up. We could ask for a sorting of the array in descending, so it'd start with 100 and go to 10, so each of these is a command that might provide a result for us. And to give you a feel for it, if we move over on the right-hand side of the lecture slide here, we see D3 visualization, we've got some D3 statements, and we're working in the console in the browser here, and we can simply enter some of these statements. So we ran this particular page, this particular piece of code. It's now resident in the DOM, and we might enter a statement in the console, D3 mean from the array. And of course it comes back, hey, your mean is 55. Then we might ask for the sum, and it comes back, hey, the sum is 550. So just some examples of how we might use those commands with an equivalent piece of code. Now we can also do something called transitions in D3 that will provide animation. So we can add animation to objects using the transitions. If we look at our code, on the left-hand side there on D3 script, so the first thing we define is our canvas, which we've done several times before, and then we'll create a circle using SVG. So our circle, we append our circle to the canvas. We have coordinates of x, y that we define in attributes at 100 and 100, radius of 50. Then we come back and we can create transition. So this transition will give it animation. So we have circle transition, and then we're going to use something called duration. So duration is basically how long do you want it to take to perform this step. And this is expressed in, thousandths or a second, so a thousandth's a second. So this is 2 seconds. We want it to delay 1 second before the next step. So we're going to start this particular function. We're going to ask D3 to select it and fill it with blue. So after we've engaged this transition, fill it with blue. Then we have an attribute. We're going to change where it is on the x-axis, and we're going to move it over to 350. So remember, it started at 100, so we're going to move it over to 350. Then we're going to change where it is on the y, so we're going to move it down to 350. Then we're going to change the x and change the y back to a location of 100, 100. And then we're going to wrap it up with that last statement that's going to turn the circle red. So let's take a look at how transitions work to provide us with some animation in D3. So now let's bring in the code for our D3 transitions. So here's our D3 library. We're creating our canvas. We've described that we're going to create a circle, start with that circle in a particular position, 100, 100, the radius of 50. Then we're going to come in with some transitions. This time we're going to give it a duration of 3 seconds to make this transition. Then we're going to delay a second. We're going to move to the position 350, 350 on the X and Y. Then we'll change the Y to 350, then change the X to 100 and the Y to 100. And then at the end, we're going to change our circle and turn it red. So let's take a look at how that runs. So there was our 3-second delay, and then it moves back and turns red. So that's how we can create a transition. And we did a fairly simple transition here with the circle, but know that you can do transitions with any particular shape or object in D3. So now let's talk about a concept of bootstrapping with D3. So there have been a lot of data visualizations created in D3, and there's a whole bunch of them that are out on the web and available to you. So in order to bootstrap with D3, the first thing we need to do is find examples that serve as a model. So there's several different locations, and we're going to point those out to you here in a minute. Once you find a model that you really like, that you think, hey, this is something I want to create, you'll review the visualization, make sure visually it's what you want. Then we'll analyze the code and data files. So in several locations on the web, the visualization code as well as the data that drives it will be posted out there together. Then once you have those two, you'll go in and recreate the visualization as it was designed. So you can make slight adjustments to the visual representation if you wish, but probably the smartest thing to do for the first time out is just run the code as it was with the data files it had and just make sure it works properly. Then you can go in and change the data files. So you may have a different data file that you want to visualize, create sort of the same view, but with different data. So you can adjust the data files. Then you might want to adjust some of the code for functionality. Maybe you don't want some of the elements as large, or you want them smaller, or you want them adjusted or scaled in a different way. So you can make those adjustments to the code for functionality. And then, of course, save it and rerun it and see how it goes. So where can I find some of these examples to bootstrap with? So the D3 organization has a whole set of examples online. So if you search for data-driven documents, you will find this particular library. You can click on examples, and as you'll see in the center of the screen there's all kinds of different data visualization examples that you can use as a model. So you can also run a search for different locations, and here I've run a search for some examples and found Mike Bostock's library on GitHub. So Mike Bostock has provided a pretty extensive library of his data visualization projects. You can see that MBOSTOCK/D3, so that's this particular directory on GitHub. And you can see there's a number of diagrams, visualization types under the visual index. You can scroll through there, find one that you like. When you find one that you like, you can view the selected visualization. So click on it, view it. Some examples may contain different code sections. You'll of course have an index. Sometimes you'll have different files, maybe a JSON data file, a style sheet file in CSS, maybe a comma separated value data file, and then maybe a JavaScript file as well. So you might have a number of different pieces of code there. So in this example, you can see each of those. So we have our index code file there, basically the HTML code. Then we have our style sheet out to the right of it. We have a particular matrix file in JSON. And then we have a data file for different teams, comma separated values. So once you've thoroughly reviewed it and decided, hey, I think this is something that looks good, that I want, you can then set upon replicating the visualization code. And what you want to do the first time out is just try to run the code as it was posted, just to make sure it works right. So you'll bring in the HTML code. You can copy and paste lines of code or the whole thing into your text editor, and then save it as a new file, whatever you want to call it. Then you identify data files, so you can create searches through the HTML code or JavaScript code using find. And often you're looking for how are style sheets applied, the .css, where am I bringing in the data sets, that sort of thing. So you just search through the code examples. You replicate the existing visualization in a development environment. So once you've brought in those files, you just basically run the HTML code, see how it renders in the browser. Then you might change the data files. So probably you started off intending to visualize something different than what you found. So you want to compare the existing data files with the new data file, or what you'd like to visualize, what the data values are. And then you'll adjust the new data file structures to work with the visualization. Then you'll save the new data files, update the new data file names in the code. So remember that the HTML code is going to be looking for whatever data file name you've called it. So make sure you sync those two up. So here's where we're updating the name of our files in the code. And then you drag your HTML code, you save your HTML code, you drag it over to a browser, and you see how the visualization runs. You test the visualization. And then you can go in and adjust the code for functionality. So if the data visualization was almost what you wanted, but it had some exceptions, so you'll go in and change the visualization aspects that you want in the code, and then save it. And that's basically how you bootstrap some of the work that's already been done for your own purposes. In summary, D3 is a program library of instructions for data visualization. Data in an array or data that's brought into the DOM drives the document. And what we mean by documents are the web pages. D3 works with SVG shapes, allowing dynamic definition of those shapes. So based on the data that we brought into the DOM, we can engage an SVG shape, and D3 will bind the data from the DOM to the SVG shape specification and basically draw that particular shape. So different sizes, shapes, and position that we draw can be determined by data values, which is just another way of saying can be driven by the data values in the DOM. And then finally, there's a very large library of sample data visualizations out on the web. You could look at Mike Bostock's collection in GitHub or on the D3 website, as well as a number of other locations to get great ideas about a new data visualization that you want to create for your project. This concludes the lecture on D3.